Hey there and welcome back to the channel where I'm trying to start a brand new business from scratch based on a new type of pet carrier that I've invented for cats and small dogs. Now, if you're brand new to the channel, essentially over the past 16 to 18 months, I've spent about $25,000 to go through product design and engineering and to get this prototype delivered to me, which you can see sitting on the table behind me, and then also to file for patents in North America. Now, the next step for me is to try to launch this product on Kickstarter and to generate enough demand for the product that I can actually afford the startup costs for manufacturing, which are going to be actually pretty expensive. And in today's video, we're going to go through exactly how much I think I'm going to need from Kickstarter in order to be able to successfully roll this over into an actual business and to be able to afford those startup costs. Now, when it comes to starting a Kickstarter campaign, the first thing you have to do is put in a few basic details about your project, what it's called, and when you're planning on launching. But once you get through that, the next main thing is to go through the money and the funding. So you have to choose a goal, a target for how much money you want to receive from this Kickstarter campaign. And the way that I'm setting up my Kickstarter campaign is that if I don't hit the goal, I will not receive any funds and I won't have any obligation to actually produce the cat carrier and deliver it to people. But if I do hit the target that I set for myself, then I will receive all of the money that comes through on Kickstarter and I will have an obligation to actually produce the cat carriers and ship them to everybody that backed the project. So I do have to be somewhat strategic here in setting this goal. And I'm going to talk about the different considerations now because it's definitely not as simple as you might think. So let's walk through it. For starters, in all of the research that I've done on how to run a successful Kickstarter campaign, it seems pretty universal across the board that people suggest that you try to hit your funding target on day one, day two, or at least within the first week of launching your Kickstarter campaign. Because once you do that, then you actually have an opportunity for the Kickstarter algorithm to promote you, to be featured on the homepage, and generally speaking, it helps you a lot with organic reach and getting people's eyeballs on the product or service, whatever you're selling on Kickstarter, without you actually having to pay marketing costs to acquire potential customers. Now, the issue with that is that since you set the funding target up front and you don't necessarily know if the campaign is going to be successful or not, you're kind of incentivized to set the target lower than an amount you might necessarily want to get because you want to try and make sure that you actually hit the target in the first couple of days of actually launching the campaign. On the other hand, once you do hit the target, then you are guaranteed to receive all those funds from Kickstarter and you do have an obligation to produce whatever you're promising. And so you don't want to set that initial target too low because let's say you just barely hit it, but you don't actually exceed it by very much, then maybe you haven't left yourself enough wiggle room to actually be able to afford the startup costs for manufacturing to actually produce the product. So that's the issue that I'm going through right now. I'm going to actually walk you through the specific numbers because I have quotes from two different manufacturing companies on how much it's going to cost me to actually get the equipment created that's going to allow me to mass produce these cat carriers. All right, I'm going to start with this one, and this is a quote from a factory in China from the Shenzhen region. And you can see there's 4 different line items here, and essentially I need to create a mold, a metal mold of the different parts of the cat carrier, and that's going to allow liquefied plastic to be injected into the mold, and then it comes apart and the piece is formed. And so I'm going to need molds for all the different component parts of the cat carrier. And so these are the 4 different pieces currently, and these are the costs right here. As you can see, well, it's not highlighting very well, but in this column here, the third from the last. So, and these are all in US dollars. The quote for the 2 large pieces, the base and the lid, comes to over 55,000 US dollars each piece. And then the smaller pieces just for the handles are 7,000. So the total amount on this quote from the factory in China is 127,000 US dollars. And that also doesn't include shipping fees once the actual pieces have been created and potential import duties and taxes and things like that. Then I got a quote from a local company here in Canada for the same exact pieces. And you can see here in the last column that this quote is actually higher, even though it turns out that they would just be contracting with another factory in the same area in China. Anyways, the quote here is for $75,000 for the base piece, $66,000 for the lid, and $20,000 for the handles. So overall, a little bit more expensive. Now let's go over here because I put this information into a spreadsheet, and just straight up off the bat, I'm gonna say I've more or less at this point ruled out manufacturing in China. I think there's some logistics issues with shipping, and they have constant lockdowns, and also then you have to deal with taxes and import duties, and just generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of the idea of manufacturing something that's so far away that I don't have an opportunity to visit and do quality control checks before shipping it across the ocean. So just generally speaking, I think there's a number of issues with it. Now, of course, it is marginally cheaper, but given the fact that shipping costs have actually been quite high, it's brought the cost to manufacture something in China and then ship it here to North America, the landed cost of those products, to be much closer to the cost of actually manufacturing it locally. And that, I think, sort of tips the scale for me in terms of wanting to produce it locally. So here I've input all the information for made in Canada pet carriers. And essentially the total fixed cost that I'm going to need to come up with from this Kickstarter campaign is $162,000. But of course, that's just for the molds that I'm going to use to manufacture the product. And then after that, let's say if I have 1,000 people purchase this product from me on Kickstarter in a pre-launch phase, that means that I'm going to have to produce 1,000 cat carriers. And so I also need to factor in the cost to produce those and then to ship them to people. And so I've tried to model that down here. Now, the numbers are definitely in flux, and it also depends on how many units I manufacture. So in case B here, column B, this is assuming that it's a 1,000 unit order and 5,000 and then 10,000. And obviously it gets less and less expensive the more that you order. So the price per unit, if I'm only ordering, let's say 1,000, could be around $30 US, but the price per unit if I'm ordering 10,000 could come down to 24 or 24.70 US. So it's a pretty significant difference if you actually manufacture in bulk. So when I'm thinking about setting my Kickstarter funding target, I have to factor in, first of all, the fixed cost for the upfront manufacturing equipment that I'm gonna need. Then I also have to factor in the variable cost of producing the units that I'll be promising to people as they pledge money on the Kickstarter campaign. And then of course there's other things that I have to factor in, like potentially paying tax on this money, and then also dealing with shipping and handling for sending the product to people once it's actually been created. Oh, and also Kickstarter takes a percentage of the total amount. I think it's around 8%. It might be slightly higher or slightly lower, but I also have to factor that in. But this row here, 25, shows the total costs that I'm going to have to cover essentially in the three different scenarios if I'm producing 1,000, 5,000, or 10,000. And the next column here is showing how much I'm going to need to charge per unit to break even based on that alone. And so basically what these numbers are showing me here is that if I only manage to get 1,000 units pre-ordered on Kickstarter, I'm going to have to charge nearly $200 US per unit just to break even, and that might not be feasible. It's going to make it a lot more difficult to actually pull this off. However, if I manage to miraculously somehow sell 10,000 units, then my break-even cost would only be $40 per unit. And of course, this is also paying for the upfront cost of having the manufacturing equipment created. And moving forward, this equipment, which I'd be paying $162,000 US for, would be good for approximately 300,000 units over time. So once you pay that off, everything else is just gravy, and you can keep just churning out the profit, essentially assuming that there's still demand for the product. And that's what this Kickstarter campaign is supposed to be. It's supposed to be essentially me testing the market to see if there's actually demand for this cat carrier. And then if it's successful, I'll know that I'll be able to continue marketing it after the fact, set it up on something like a Shopify store or sell it on Amazon, and just keep churning out the product. Okay, now stick with me here because we're almost to the part where I'm going to talk about where I think I need to set my funding target. But here I've factored in the fees that Kickstarter is going to take. So they do take 8% of the total amount, and then there's a flat processing fee per transaction, which I think is something like 20 cents per transaction. Yeah, that's right. So depending on how many units I sell, that is going to vary, but that's really not that big a deal. It's the variable 8% fee that really does take a decent sized chunk out of the total revenue that comes on Kickstarter. Now, I have not factored in shipping into these calculations, which is definitely something that I need to do. There's a couple different ways that I can figure out how to do it. I can charge for shipping separately, so I'm not necessarily including it as a part of these calculations, but I do need to figure that out at some point. Anyways, I think that charging somewhere in the realm of $100 per unit would be reasonable. And this is not very scientific. It's not based off of extensive market research. It's more or less based off of me checking out what some competitor products are charging that are more in the premium pet carrier kind of realm. And so you can definitely find other cat carriers or dog carriers that charge in excess of $100. So I think somewhere around that price point would be reasonable. I don't think I'm going to be able to charge $192 per unit and actually be able to sell it. I don't think there's going to be nearly as much demand at that price point as there would be at somewhere around $100. But the issue with that is if I'm only charging $100 per unit and I only sell 1,000 units on Kickstarter, then I'm only going to take in 99,000. Also subtract the Kickstarter fees, subtract potential taxes, and also account for shipping, I'm going to be left with a hole of more than negative $100,000, potentially much larger. And so that means for this to even be viable at all, I either need to increase the price per unit or increase the number of units sold. Now, if I manage to sell 5,000 units on Kickstarter, that means I will take in enough to actually cover all of the upfront expenses, the fixed costs, the variable costs, the Kickstarter fees, and also, of course, taxes and shipping. And I will probably come out net positive, potentially actually make a profit off of this, although that is not necessarily the goal. I would be totally happy just simply breaking even on this, because once I have the upfront manufacturing costs paid off, I can, like I said, roll this over into a business, and then at that point start worrying about making a profit. And then of course in the pie in the sky scenario, if I somehow miraculously manage to sell 10,000 units on Kickstarter, I would take in almost $1 million in revenue and certainly be able to cover all my costs and probably make a tidy profit as well. Okay, now given all of this information, I now need to start thinking about setting a target for my Kickstarter campaign. And I know that I'm going to need at least around 200,000 US dollars to actually be able to pull this off successfully. And that's a bare minimum. But I also need to factor in that if I set my target at 200,000 US dollars and I don't hit that target quickly, then it could actually have a drag on the Kickstarter campaign and have a negative impact. So then I need to start thinking about setting the target a little bit lower, because that would make it more certain that I'm actually able to hit the target relatively quickly, and that hopefully has a snowball effect and launches the Kickstarter campaign into the stratosphere. But of course it's a risk, because if I set the target lower and just barely meet it or maybe exceed it by a small margin, that means that I will personally be responsible to cover the difference between the total $200,000 that I need and whatever the amount is that I raise. So I don't want to also set it too low, because then it might screw myself over. So this is where I'm at right now, and I'm toying with the decision. I'm thinking about actually going a little bit on the lower end of things, because of course I'm a risk-taking person and I have no problem living life on the edge. But of course I don't want to set it too low. So I'm thinking maybe 99,000 or 100,000 would be the lowest that I want to set it. But also there are those strategic considerations that maybe I do want to set it a little bit higher and have more margin for error to make sure that I won't be personally liable to spend tens of thousands of more dollars out of my own pocket to cover any differences, any shortfalls. So that's where I'm at right now. Let me know what you think, especially if you have any experience with this sort of thing. I'll be bringing you regular updates, so if you want to continue seeing behind the scenes footage of how I'm going about launching this product on Kickstarter and hopefully turning it into a legitimate business, then please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and potentially check out this, which is another video that I think you might like. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.